Okay, let's unpack this. We all have stuff, right? Things we own.
Hmm.
Maybe it's a phone, a house, that favorite coffee mug. It seems simple enough, this idea of property.
On the surface, yeah.
But what if I told you that throughout history, some thinkers believed that simply owning things was a form of theft?
That's a pretty radical idea.
Or that the state was only created to protect property, not necessarily people in the broader sense?
Wow. Okay.
And what if the very concept of who made something and who deserves to benefit from it is incredibly complex, especially today? Think about global supply chains, massive corporations.
Gets messy fast.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging headfirst into the deep and, well, surprisingly complicated waters of the right to property.
And we've got some really rich source material here. It gives us an in-depth look at how political theories have grappled with this fundamental concept over centuries.
So we're going to explore these different perspectives, from early liberal champions of ownership to modern critics and even revolutionary thinkers.
Exactly. The goal is to understand where these ideas come from, what they actually say about the nature and scope of property, and its role in society.
Right. Our mission really is to extract the crucial insights, the key arguments, maybe the surprising connections buried in these sources. Also, you can become more informed on a topic that isn't just abstract economics.
No, it really isn't. It literally shapes power dynamics, the distribution of resources, the world around us.
And as the source material reveals pretty quickly, unlike rights like, say, freedom of speech or the right to assembly.
Or you can often draw a clearer line, maybe.
Yeah, where one person's right bumps into another's, property is inherently tricky.
hmm Because one person's claim to property, especially certain types like land or, the means of production,
Yeah.
it can very quickly seem to diminish another person's access, maybe even their basic needs or opportunities. And that's where the complexity really kicks in.
Absolutely. So let's start right there. What is property in this context, and why does the source material highlight this difficulty? Why is it so hard to define its boundaries compared to other rights?
That's a great place to start, and the source material definitely emphasizes this point early on. Think about liberty again. We often try to define its limits by saying, your freedom stops where it harms or unjustly interferes with someone else's.
Right, there's a kind of reciprocity there,
Yeah.
potentially.
But property,
Mhm.
it's just qualitatively different in its social implications.
Because it's not always something you physically created yourself through your own effort alone.
Precisely. The source points out that property can be something not made by man at all. It could be inherited or simply occupied, maybe through chance or force or just tradition.
Land being the obvious example.
Land is the classic historically significant example. You inherit it, you occupy it. You didn't create the physical earth. You came to possess it through some historical mechanism, not personal creation.
And even today, think about how things are made, like building a skyscraper or manufacturing a car. It's a massive collaborative effort.
Hugely collaborative.
You've got architects, designers, engineers, laborers doing the physical work, suppliers, investors putting up capital, managers coordinating, maybe thousands of people.
Easily. All contributing different skills, different amounts of labor.
So who really made that final product in a way that one person can just claim it as solely the fruit of their labor?
That's a core difficulty the source highlights, using modern examples. In these complex cooperative efforts that define most modern production, an individual's share in the product, or maybe more accurately, the reward they get from that product, it isn't usually determined by the objective value of their actual contribution to making it.
Okay, that's a critical point the source is making. So if it's not about the value of what you actually contributed, what does the source material say determines how the economic pie gets sliced up?
Well, the source lists several powerful external factors. You got market forces like demand for the product, the supply of labor or capital, competition, all that. Then there's previous investment or ownership.
Yeah.
If you already own the factory or the land or the starting capital, your position is fundamentally different regardless of your labor in this particular production cycle.
Right. Your starting point matters hugely.
Hugely. Technological development also plays a massive role, obviously. And crucially, the resulting social relations embedded in the economic system itself are key.
You mean like historical structures? Master slave, lord serf?
Exactly, those historical ones. And in the modern context, the relationship between, say, the capitalist owners of the means of production and the wage-dependent worker.
Ah, so it's those existing power structures, the ownership patterns, the whole economic system that largely dictate who gets what, often overriding the actual effort someone put in.
That's the argument. And the source calls this out very explicitly. It says this fundamental disconnect between individual contribution and the reward received creates abundant scope for exploitation.
Exploitation, because the link is broken.
Yes, because if your reward isn't directly tied to your contribution or the service you rendered to society, then the whole pattern of ownership and distribution starts to look, well, inconsistent with the moral basis we usually assume when we talk about justifying rights, like the right to property itself.
And this is the fundamental issue the source material seems to explore across all these different theories, right? How do you take this thing, property ownership, which can lead to exploitation and inequality, and make it serve social justice instead? How do you stop it from being a weapon?
That's precisely the core tension. When property, particularly wealth and productive assets, gets highly concentrated.
In fewer hands.
Right. The source argues it directly obstructs others from having a significant share, not just in the wealth produced, but also in the opportunities property can provide. This division of society into haves and have-nots, it's seen as a major threat.
A threat to what the source calls the spirit of fraternity, that sense of community.
Exactly, that sense of commonality, brotherhood. It's hard to maintain that feeling when you have these glaring, vast disparities in how people live, some in immense luxury, others struggling for basics.
Yeah, you can see that. And the source mentions how these disparities were defended historically, using justifications that sound pretty weak to us now.
It mentions the use of pseudo-religious pretensions, things like poverty being your fate from a past life, or maybe the price you pay for rewards in the afterlife.
Or just God ordained it this way.
Right, that kind of thing.
That's what, well, a poor consolation, as the source says, for someone actually experiencing poverty.
The source agrees, quite emphatically, calls it a poor consolation, and basically a device used historically to cover up existing injustice. And the critical point the source makes here is that modern consciousness, sort of across the enlightened world, generally regards these kinds of justifications as invalid for organizing society now.
We can't rely on those anymore.
No. The real justification for property rights, and crucially, their ethical limits, has to be sought and debated within our existing institutional framework, based on principles of justice and utility in this world, not appeals to divine prospects or fate.
Okay, so focusing on the here and now, within our human institutions, what are we actually talking about when we say property or private property in this context? What does it include?
The source defines it broadly, primarily as the possession of material things that are open to personal or selfish use. That distinguishes it from, say, communal property or public goods.
Material things, like land, houses, physical objects you can touch.
Yes, those are definitely included. But it expands on that, reflecting modern economies. It also includes documents that represent entitlements to things or their value, even if you don't physically hold the asset.
Like stocks and bonds. Patents.
Exactly. Promissory notes, patents, shares in companies, guarantees things that embody a claim to wealth or the product of labor. It even mentions older forms like property in birds or animals.
Got it. So it's about having a claim on resources or things of value you can use for yourself. But there's a really crucial modern exception, the source points out, something that cannot be property.
Absolutely essential, and a clear sign of evolved thinking. While property in things, even animals, has been recognized, property in human beings' slavery is absolutely not recognized by modern consciousness. The source is emphatic on this.
And the reason given for rejecting slavery is fundamental to modern human rights thinking, isn't it?
Yes, precisely. The source explained that modern consciousness regards all human beings, regardless of birth or status, always as end in themselves, not as means to an end.
That Kantian idea.
Exactly. You cannot reduce another human being to being merely an instrument for your purposes, your private property. That's a fundamental moral and legal line modern thought draws very firmly.
Okay, that makes complete sense. So, property is complex. Its distribution isn't always simply tied to contribution. It can lead to exploitation. Its justification now has to be grounded in earthly justice. And crucially, it absolutely excludes owning other people.
Right, and building on that complexity and the potential for social conflict, the source tells us that different major perspectives, liberal, social democratic, Marxist, analyze this right to property very differently. They offer competing justifications, critiques, and proposals.
Okay, let's dig into the liberal tradition first, because a lot of our modern ideas about private property really come from there, don't they?
They absolutely do. Early liberalism, emerging as feudalism waned and market economies rose, was a really strong defender of property rights. It saw property as an essential ingredient of man's liberty and his right to the pursuit of happiness.
So owning things was directly tied to being free and self-sufficient.
That was the core idea. The source gives some powerful examples. Machiavelli's rather cynical observation.
The one about forgetting your father's death faster than losing your inheritance.
That's the one. Men sooner forget the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony. It just starkly shows how deeply attached people felt to inherited property, their identity, security, standing.
Wow. Suggesting material inheritance was almost more fundamental than family ties for social order.
Then you have Hobbes, arguing people formed a state largely for the security of life and property, escaping that chaotic state of nature.
So protecting your stuff was a primary job of the state from the get-go in that view.
In that foundational view, yes. And Locke, famously, put property right alongside life and liberty as fundamental natural rights, existing before government.
Right. The state was created to protect these rights, including property.
Exactly. The state was obliged to recognize it, having no authority to tamper with this right arbitrarily. It suggested property rights came from something deeper, natural, inherent.
And Rousseau, even though he differed from Locke in many ways, still saw security of property as essential for civil liberty provided by the state.
Right. Then came the classical liberals Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham. They added the utilitarian and economic arguments. Property wasn't just a right, it was an essential instrument of social progress.
How so? What was their reasoning?
Their idea, as the source explains, was rooted in self-interest leading to public good. Individuals pursuing profit through their property, their capital, land, business, would naturally allocate resources to meet consumer demand efficiently. The profit motive, working through markets,
Would benefit the whole community, like an invisible hand.
That was the central idea, connecting individual property to collective welfare. And the source notes this really formed the foundation of market economy and the capitalist system.
And they even linked property to political rights, like needing property to vote.
Yes, early liberalism often linked property ownership to having a stake in the state, seeing it as a signifier of political wisdom, which led to those historical property qualifications for voting. This whole era, the source summarizes, it really sought to glorify and defend the right to property.
But things changed. Liberalism evolved, right? Especially once the realities of the Industrial Revolution hit hard, the poverty, the inequality alongside the growth.
Absolutely. Modern liberal theory couldn't really ignore the often cruel operation of the capitalist system. And with socialist theories challenging the status quo, it became harder to see property as this completely sacred or absolute right the state couldn't touch.
J.S. Mill seems like a key figure in that shift within liberalism.
He is highlighted as really important. Initially, a strong defender, his later thought, shaped by observing social conditions, led him to advocate for considerable restriction, especially on inheritance and bequest.
He was critical of inheriting huge fortunes.
Yes, and also notably critical of private property and land. He called land the original inheritance of all mankind, questioning absolute private ownership of something not made by human effort.
And he had a specific point about land value increasing without the owner doing anything.
Exactly. Mill argued land value, and the rent from it often shot up without any effort on the part of landlords, just due to population growth, economic development nearby, societal factors.
The unearned increment.
Right. And he felt this unearned wealth should be taxed, with the revenue diverted to the community, especially the working class, who actually produced wealth from the land or whose labor boosted its value.
That sounds like an early version of taxing unearned income or wealth generated by society, not just individual work.
It really does. Then you have T.H. Green, another key figure in new liberalism. He still saw property, especially personal property, as important for moral freedom, for self-realization.
But with a crucial but.
A crucial but. He argued, if unrestrained property rights let some accumulate so much wealth and power that it prevented others from getting the property they needed for their self-realization.
Using landed property as a prime example again.
Yes. Then that unrestrained right actually hindered overall social freedom. So he strongly pleaded for reasonable restrictions in the interest of the social good.
So the liberal view starts shifting from property as this absolute hands-off right to something that needs to be weighed against its social impact. Does it help everyone achieve freedom and well-being, or just a few?
Exactly. It became less about an inherent right existing before society and more about property needing to serve a social function. And thinkers like L.T. Hobhouse and H.J. Lasky, who we'll definitely get into more detail on later.
They pushed this even further.
They did, arguing explicitly for property's social origins and the need for it to serve a clear social function or be tied to service performed.
Okay, so modern liberalism starts focusing less on just defending the right and more on investigating its ethical basis, considering consequences and figuring out its proper limits.
Precisely. And this critical look at property's basis leads us right into the different theories about where property rights even come from, how they've been justified or critiqued. The source uses Morris Ginsburg's framework here, which is helpful.
Ginsburg had three types of theories: natural rights, modes of origin, and contribution to public good. We've touched on natural rights.
Right. We'll look at the first two now, natural rights and modes of origin, and save the public good one for a bit later.
Okay, so natural rights theories, again, property as fundamental, inherent, existing before institutions.
Yes. But the source points out this idea of an individual inherent natural right to property is actually relatively recent, historically. Really took off with thinkers like Locke.
What were the older views before liberalism?
The source mentions Stoic and patristic ideas, common in early Christian thought. The idea that by nature all things are held in common.
Everything belonged to everyone initially.
That was the idea. In a purer state, maybe before the fall, there was no mine and thine distinct. Private property only became necessary later because of human greed and avarice, which had to be kept in check by dividing things up to avoid constant conflict.
So private ownership wasn't the ideal state, but a practical fix for human imperfection. Not a natural right, but a consequence of losing innocence.
That's the interpretation presented for those older views. Medieval natural law thinkers, like Aquinas, generally saw private property as not strictly part of natural law itself, though not contrary to it either. More like a practical arrangement for social order.
Permitted, but not fundamental.
Kind of. Later modern scholasticism called it a secondary natural right, but still under the conditions of natural law. Even someone like William Blackstone, writing in the 18th century, while listing property among absolute rights, seemed to apply that mainly to possession. The right to hold something now. He viewed inheritance and bequest, passing property on after death, as purely civil rights, granted by society's laws, not natural ones.
That's a fascinating distinction. Holding it is natural, but passing it on is social.
In Blackstone's view, yeah. Suggesting a key part of property as we know it is socially constructed.
Yeah.
Locke, though, saw natural rights differently, coming from inward morality, conscience, or the rational faculty, inherent. The state had to protect it.
Even though he linked that right back to labor, which puts him in the next category.
Exactly. Theories based on modes of origin, how property is acquired.
Right, like first occupation, taking something unowned.
Yes. The source mentions that, but dismisses it as mostly of historical or academic interest now. Most land is already claimed.
Okay. The big one here is the labor theory.
Yes, the labor theory is highly important, used by liberals to justify ownership, but then developed very differently by socialists. Locke is the key liberal exponent.
His argument being, you own yourself, so you own your labor.
Right. You have property in your own person, your labor is yours. So when you mix that labor with something from nature that was previously unowned...
You make it yours. You add something of yourself.
Exactly. You make it your property, excluding the common right of others. And then there's his famous proviso.
At least where there is enough and as good left in common for others.
That proviso. Many see that as the most ethically compelling part of his original argument, a potential limit. The source notes the American and French revolutions also used this idea of property as the fruit of labor to justify rights against aristocracy.
But the source, following critics like Ginsburg and McPherson, points out a major inconsistency in how Locke actually applied this theory.
Yes, Ginsburg notes that while Locke did recognize, in principle, that you're only entitled to what you can use without spoilage.
Anything beyond that belongs to others.
Right. But in his actual arguments about society's development, Locke accepts and justifies existing inequalities. He doesn't use his theory to critique them.
How did he justify the big inequalities then, if his own theory seemed to set limits?
The source says he attributed it mainly to the consent of men to use money, which allowed for accumulating more land than one could use directly. And he claimed, nature provides no principles for regulating inequalities.
So the social agreement about money somehow overrides the natural limits of use and leaving enough for others. That feels like a leap.
Many critics saw it exactly that way. Like, well, people agreed to money, so unequal accumulation is fine now, even if it means there isn't enough and as good left for everyone else.
Feels like justifying the status quo.
C.B. McPherson's concept of possessive individualism is used by the source to characterize the underlying assumptions McPherson saw in Locke's view.
Possessive individualism. What does that mean, according to McPherson's reading of Locke?
It's a critical interpretation seeing Locke's philosophy as grounded in specific market-oriented assumptions. The core ideas, summarized by the source, are like this. First, man is seen as the owner of his own capacities, owing nothing to society for them.
Self-ownership, basically.
Right. Second, he's free to use these capacities for his own satisfaction, as long as he doesn't harm others. Third, freedom itself is largely defined as domination over things' ownership. The more you own, the freer you are.
Freedom as possession.
Fourth, society is just a collection of these free, equal individuals connected mainly through their possessions and market relations, not deep communal ties or duties. Fifth, the fundamental social relation is exchange, the market.
Okay.
And sixth, political society, the state, is just a rational device created to protect property, with life and liberty themselves kind of framed as possessions to be defended.
Wow. That paints society less as a community, more as a marketplace of self-interested owners.
The source brings in Jeremy Waldron's work on Locke, explaining how money was key to enabling this system and getting around Locke's initial limits. Money is durable, not like apples.
Doesn't spoil.
Right. It's a conventionally sanctioned, durable means of exchange. Waldron argues its existence allowed men to own and profit from much more land than they themselves could use the produce of. You just sell the surplus for money.
The spoilage limit disappears with money. You can accumulate value indefinitely.
Exactly. So this critique argues that this combination, labor theory's application, the consent to inequality via money, the focus on acquisition, led many to see Locke as, maybe unintentionally, an ideologist of early modern capitalism, justifying the emerging system.
So the conclusion on Locke is, started with a potentially progressive labor idea, but ended up justifying inequalities through expediency, forgetting logic, paving the way for bigger ones.
That's the critical assessment presented. And they connect this justification of inequality to utilitarian philosophers too, though from a different angle. Utilitarians aimed for greatest happiness of the greatest number, seeming egalitarian. But Jati, the source says, they often conceded that inequality has to be tolerated as a necessary evil.
Why? What was the pragmatic reason for tolerating inequality if the goal was greatest happiness?
Their fear, according to the source, was that trying to equalize wealth too much would supposedly discourage effort, decrease saving, lessen efficiency, and ultimately diminish the total available for distribution.
So keeping inequality provided incentives to create more wealth overall, which they thought was better for everyone in the long run than strict equality.
That was the argument. Maintain inequality to grow the pie, even if the slices are uneven. And the source argues this utilitarian concession prepared a strong foundation for the development of the capitalist system with enormous inequalities.
It provided a rational-sounding justification for disparities.
Exactly. And the source points out a critical blind spot in many early liberal and utilitarian thinkers. They championed political liberty, free speech, assembly against state power, but they often failed to see how the massive property inequality they justified
Allowed capitalists to wield power over workers, depriving them of economic liberty.
Precisely. It, in effect, meant allowing the capitalist to exercise power over the life and labor of others. You might be politically free, but if your survival depends entirely on a property owner, are you truly free economically?
It's a crucial question, and the result was starkly different realities.
Yes, the source describes conditions of leisure and conspicuous consumption for some, versus rigorous labor and subhuman living for others. For critics, this amounts to oppression, exploitation, and injustice, not the freedom so highly valued by the liberal theorists.
Okay, so the liberal use of the labor theory and utilitarianism ended up supporting inequality. How did socialists take that same starting point labor and reach such different conclusions?
The socialist postulate, starting from labor creating property, was fundamentally different. Their core claim: the worker has a right to the whole produce of his labor.
Much more direct. If you made it, it's yours.
Right. And they drew a crucial distinction, maybe one liberals avoided, between property in the means of production and property in the fruits of labor.
Means of production, the factories, land, tools, fruits of labor, the actual stuff produced.
Correct. And the socialist conclusion was the very opposite of Locke's individualism, their logic. If the means of production are owned privately by a few,
Then everyone else loses their freedom, their ability to work independently.
Exactly. They can't apply their labor freely. Therefore, to ensure true freedom for all, the means of production must be held in common by society or the workers collectively. Everyone needs access to apply their labor, and the results should be shared by collective regulation, not private profit.
That's a fundamental shift, from individual ownership of tools to collective ownership of the essential means of production.
Yes, and this leads us to Ginsburg's third category. Theories that judge property by its contribution to the public good or well-being.
And the source says these are especially significant today.
Highly relevant because of industrialization, capital concentration. Property isn't just a small farm anymore. It's a huge means of control over others' life and labor. These theories aim to make property subservient to social justice, not just personal gratification or power.
This is where the social democratic perspective comes in, trying to synthesize things.
Exactly. Social democracy tries to navigate that tension, maintain property rights, but under conditions serving both socialist principles, social purpose, and democratic principles, individual freedom.
A middle ground between radical individualism and total collectivism.
Kind of. The idea isn't usually outright abolition, but allowing private ownership under comprehensive regulations, ensuring it's largely used to serve social purpose. Thinkers like L.T. Hobhouse, R.H. Taney, Harold Laski are key here.
Let's start with Hobhouse. He had that powerful argument about property's social origin.
Very compelling. In liberalism, he argued property rights depend entirely on the organized force of society, the state, law, police. That's what maintains your claim. Without society's backing, your property right is not worth a week's purchase.
So property security isn't natural, it's provided by society.
Precisely. It's yours because society says so and protects it. He used that vivid example of the prosperous businessman crediting only his own self-help.
Right. Hobhouse pointed out all the societal things he relied on.
Completely. The ordered tranquility guaranteed by the state, secure transport, skilled labor educated by society, the sum of intelligence which civilization has placed at his disposal, accumulated knowledge, technology.
Even the demand for his products.
Even the demand, created by the general progress of the world. Modern production rests on inventions built by collective effort of generations. His conclusion, society isn't just protecting property, it's an indispensable partner in its original creation.
Society helps create the value and the possibility of wealth.
Yes, and building on this, in the Elements of Social Justice, Hobhouse criticized property used as an instrument of power. Concentrated land ownership determines livelihoods. Monopoly power arises. Uneven wealth gives capital owners advantages in contracting with workers, huge control over labor.
Magnified in modern industry with its scale and concentration.
Right, allowing capitalists to dictate terms, make huge profits, widen disparities, and the profit motive can lead them to disregard public needs, neglecting vital but less profitable services.
So what was Hobhouse's solution or qualification for property rights?
Two main ethical qualifications. A, property must not be used as an instrument of power over others, and B, it must be exercised with due regard to the needs of the community.
That really shifts property from a purely private right to one with major social obligations.
It does. R.H. Taney picked up a similar thread in The Acquisitive Society, famously attacking the tyranny of functionless property.
Functionless property, just owning stuff to get income without doing anything useful.
Exactly. Taney argued society should be organized based on function and service. What contribution do you make? Not just acquisition for its own sake. He contrasted the questions. An acquisitive society asks, what dividends does it pay? A functional society asks, what service does it perform? Property must be subordinate to social service.
Property needs a job to do for society.
Precisely. It must be earned and justified by its contribution. And Harold Laski is presented as a great exponent of positive liberalism who really integrated these ideas, modifying liberal theory with socialist influence to argue property must be an instrument of the common good.
Laski really hammered home this idea of property tied to function as a moral requirement.
He did, especially in A Grammar of Politics. He argued the right to property exists and is morally justified only if what's owned is important for the service I perform. It must be related to the common welfare. It's not absolute.
He sounds quite radical for a liberal.
Very. He stated flatly, no room for functionless property in a just society. And even more strongly, no man has a moral right to property except as a return for function performed. You have no right to live without paying for his living through contribution, those living off others' efforts.
Parasitic upon society. Strong words. But the source says he wasn't against all private property.
No, that's crucial. He wasn't for total abolition. He saw that personal property could provide security, a stake in the country, allow creative expression. Poverty destroys that. Property isn't bad in itself.
So where was the specific problem for Lascoti?
The reality of concentrated capitalism. Significant property, especially industrial capital, owned by a few, not tied to active duty or service by those owners. This ownership gives immense power, control over the lives of the producers. And under free enterprise, the state becomes very largely an institution dominated by the owners of private property, protecting their interests.
Echoing earlier criticisms, but integrating it into a theory of the state.
Yes. And he listed scathing criticisms of capitalists. Using property only for private profit, ignoring social needs, production not for utility, distribution not for urgency, owners' immense wasteful expenditure versus workers' needs, owners setting corrupting standards, corrupting society by producing only for profit, ruining resources, adulterating goods, dishonest enterprises, corrupting legislatures, compelling strikes.
He saw profit-driven property as deeply corrosive, and he tackled the standard defenses of property head-on.
Systematically, incentive to labor. Capitalists work for profit, not community, and inheritance lest descendants stop working. Ethical return for effort. Reward depends on profit capacity, manipulation, not service value. Nurse of virtues. Virtues exist in those without property, too.
What about supplying effective demand, producing what people want?
He rejected that powerfully. What about demand for slaves? Obscene literature, prostitution. Society condemns satisfying those demands. So value isn't just market demand. It must be ethical, socially useful. Property based on harmful demands has no moral justification.
That's sharp. Tying economic justification to social morality. And the historical argument property always existed.
He acknowledged history, but called it fallacious for justifying unlimited property now. Property is a changing concept. Slavery was once valid property. Inheritance laws vary. History shows progressive limitations on property rights. You can't claim an unchanging right based on history. History shows it evolves.
So history doesn't justify the current form or lack of limits?
Exactly. Lasky argued socialist ideas and industrial reality had already pushed the state away from pure laissez-faire. The state started compromising, intervening. He listed the results: graduated taxes, ability to pay, wider franchise, free education, social insurance, corporate concern for housing, pensions.
The welfare state emerging, acknowledging public implications.
Right. And in this context, Lasky said modern consciousness no longer vindicates functionless property. He strongly advocated limiting inheritance. Property only justified if from socially useful functions and duties, not just passed down.
So what was Lasky's true justification for property, his positive vision?
Based on two things: A, a theory of reward, and B, a theory of industrial organization.
Okay, the theory of reward. How should rewards be determined?
He rejected simple answers. Not equal rewards, ignores effort, needs. Not market forces, manipulated, distort need. Not ability to needs. Too simple, who decides?
So what were his conditions for just rewards?
Two balancing conditions. Rewards must, A, enable the individual to reach their best self, develop their potential, and B, preserve and develop necessary functions of society, reconciling individual flourishing and social good.
A balance.
Yes, and crucially, society must provide a common civic minimum for everyone, especially those who can't contribute, children, old, and disabled. Beyond that minimum, reward should increase with the value of service rendered to society.
A safety net plus merit-based rewards, where merit is social value, not just profit.
Precisely, which leads to his theory of industrial organization. To implement this reward system, industry needs transformation. It must become a profession guided by a public service principle. Not just profit, but performing functions competently for the community.
Treating business like medicine or law with an ethical code.
That's the core idea. He outlined a scheme. First, change the owner's role. Capital owner gets a fixed dividend for loaning capital, not profit from management or monopolies. Second, change control. Rules set by the working force, not autocratic owners. Industry becomes an intelligible entity based on functions. Third, more social ownership. Socialized production of essentials, like power, that private firms might neglect.
All industries regulated for standards, hours, pay, replacing autocracy with democratic methods.
Based on proven competence, not just ownership.
A comprehensive plan to transform capitalism towards social control and public good, while maybe keeping some private capital under strict limits.
It is. Goal: convert functionless property into a social good. Eliminate wide disparities. Lasky concluded. Nothing inherently wrong in the notion of private prosperity if it enriches personality. But property must never be so large it grants power by sheer magnitude, nor so small the possessor cannot be himself at his best. And critically, the more equal its distribution, the more likely is the contribution of the citizen to be judged in terms of its social value.
So alter capitalism for social justice, reward service, curtail inheritance, maybe keep some fixed return private capital, remove exploitation.
That's his complex synthesis. Now let's pivot to a very different ethical starting point. Gandhi's perspective on property.
Right, Gandhi approached it through personal ethics and spirituality applied socially.
He did. Rooted in Hindu ethics and nonviolence with profound social implications. Key principles: non-possession, aparigraha, and non-stealing, asteya.
Non-possession, don't acquire more than you immediately need.
Yes. Gandhi believed amassing wealth degrades character and is basically theft depriving others in a world of need. His famous quote, "Earth has enough to satisfy everybody's need, but it does not have enough to satisfy anybody's greed."
That directly challenges the drive for unlimited accumulation.
Absolutely. Non-stealing followed. Taking more than needed is stealing from the common pool. Then he advocated bread labor.
Everyone doing some physical labor.
Yes, regardless of other work. To contribute materially, compensate for consumption. He saw it as preventing scarcity and as self-purification, connecting people to physical reality and others' needs.
Practical contribution plus character building.
Right. And his main social principle regarding property.
Trusteeship.
Trusteeship. Owners holding wealth in trust for society.
Exactly. Owners of capital or estates should treat possessions as the trust of humanity, employ them for social service, not personal gratification or profit. The owner is just a custodian, morally obligated to use wealth for the common good.
So, legal ownership maybe, but moral obligation to serve society. Precisely. Transforming the relationship from entitlement to obligation. Gandhi believed, if sincerely adopted, the tyranny of property will automatically disappear, leading to material and moral uplift.
A powerful ethical vision relying on moral transformation rather than state coercion or revolution, which contrasts sharply with the final perspective, the Marxist critique, seeing private property as the root of exploitation.
The Marxist view, Marx and Engels, is indeed radical. It sees private property not as an individual right to debate ethically, but as a historical economic condition which determines relations of production. It rejects the idea property existed eternally or is a natural right outside society.
And they link its origin intrinsically to exploitation starting.
Yes, private property emerged alongside the beginning of exploitation, and the state wasn't neutral. Marxists argue it was created by the property-owning class specifically for the protection of its private property, making the state an instrument of exploitation.
So the state as a tool of the rich to protect their stuff and power.
That's the core Marxist claim about the state under private property systems. They see history progressing through stages, each with specific property forms and antagonistic classes.
Like primitive communism first.
Yes, hypothesized early stage. Rudimentary tools held in common. Production for common consumption. Barely enough. But as productive forces developed, surplus became possible, leading to private property and class division.
Engels linked this to slavery arising.
He did, in Origin of the Family. Increased productivity made slave labor profitable, producing more than their upkeep. War captives became slaves. This first great social division of labor led to slavery, the first great division of society into two classes, masters and slaves, exploiters and exploited.
So for Marxists, private property is the basis of class division.
Fundamentally, owners of the means of production form a class with interests antagonistic to the propertyless. The form changes ancient slavery, feudalism, capitalism, but the exploitative character does not change. Always divides society into have-shaved-nots, dominant dependent classes.
And capitalism is seen as the sharpest form of this.
Absolutely. The proletariat is defined by being propertyless and dependent on wage labor. Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. Wage labor creates capital for the capitalist. That kind of property which exploits wage labor. Property under capitalism is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor.
So property isn't about harmony, it's the source of conflict and exploitation.
That's the core view. Private property here means ownership of the means of production, because that ownership determines how the propertyless live and keeps them subjugated.
Which logically leads to their call for abolition, but there's that crucial clarification.
Yes, absolutely vital. Marxists call for abolishing private property in the means of production, not personal property.
Personal property being
The fruit of a man's own labor. things acquired through your own work for personal use. Seen as the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property.
So your clothes, furniture, books, maybe a small house bought with wages?
Exactly. The argument is, when capital, means of production, a collective product, becomes common property, personal property isn't touched. Only its social character is changed. It loses its class character. It can no longer be used to exploit.
So the goal isn't taking away personal stuff, but taking away the power of a few to control essential productive assets and exploit others.
Precisely. The manifesto says, the distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. End quote. Communism deprives no one of appropriating social products, only the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriation. Focus on dismantling a system enabling exploitation.
The Marxist critique also has that powerful humanist angle about alienation.
Yes, especially from Marx's earlier manuscripts. Capitalism reduces labor to a commodity. Paradoxically, the more wealth the worker produces, the poorer he becomes, not just materially, but in human essence.
Disturbing, enriching things by devaluing people.
It is, Marx wrote. The worker becomes an ever cheaper commodity the more commodities he creates. With the increasing value of the world of things, proceeds in direct proportion the devaluation of the world of men. Labor produces commodities, and also itself and the worker as a commodity.
And how does this lead to alienation specifically?
The source details Marx's analysis. Worker has no say in production. Division of labor kills creative joy, loss of purpose. The product becomes something alien, as a power independent of the producer, owned by someone else, used against the worker. Self-estrangement or alienation.
And this happens on multiple levels.
4 main levels. A, from the product work process itself. B, from nature, stuck in artificial factories. C, from fellow men, competition, class division instead of cooperation. D, from self, reduced to animal existence, just meeting biological needs, higher human faculties lost.
A bleak picture of life under capitalism as fundamentally dehumanizing.
A picture of humans as cogs. Marx also argued modern states, despite claims of universal rights, are, in reality, the constitution of private property, structured to protect owner interests. Society ruled by the real domination of private property.
Connecting to commodity fetishism.
Yes. Coletti summarized Marx. The relationship flips. Property should be man's manifestation, but it becomes the subject. Man becomes property's property. Social relations become properties of things. Things seem to have social attributes. The fetishism of commodities.
Market value seems detached from the human labor behind it. Mystical.
Exactly. Social relations between producers, tailor, carpenter, reduced to relations between products, coat, table, via market values, skills, labor hours abstracted away. The commodity embodies value. The human worker becomes a commodity. Overall, dehumanization of man, his self-estrangement, and alienation.
Given this analysis, exploitation, class conflict, alienation, the call for abolition makes sense within the Marxist framework.
It does. Bourgeois property dominates via blind market laws, dehumanizing. Trying to just humanize it is seen as futile. Abolition is presented as necessary to restore human values, secure freedom, evolve a rational production distribution system for social needs.
Primarily for workers' emancipation.
Yes, the worst victims. And because owners benefit and control the state, Marx believed they wouldn't give up power without being overthrown in a violent revolution. He appealed to worker revolutionary zeal to abolish the system and socialize all major means of production. He saw transcending private property as the complete emancipation of all human senses and attributes.
So again, abolish private property, means of production, to end exploitation, changing ownership from bourgeois to social common. Personal property, fruits of labor for personal use, remains.
That's the crucial distinction highlighted. The manifesto, again, distinguishing feature is abolition of bourgeois property, summed up. Abolition of private property. Capital is a collective product, a social power. Communism removes only the power to subjugate the labor of others. Aim. Abolish private ownership of major means of production. Base of capitalism exploitation. Pave way for humanistic reorganization for social needs, not private profit.
Okay, wow. We've covered a huge amount of ground. From property as a sacred natural right through origins and justifications to social function and regulation, and finally the radical Marxist critique of inherent exploitation and alienation.
And the source wraps up by touching on some complexities and practical difficulties with the Marxist view, especially in modern economies.
It acknowledges the laudable idea in distinguishing personal versus private property, but suggests practical challenges.
Yes. It notes the analysis fits best with a clear two-class divide, but struggles more with modern economies having a large, complex middle class. Their issues don't always fit neatly into that framework.
Because middle-class people might own homes, have savings, investments, shares.
Exactly. When many people, including workers, invest savings via pensions or shares, the line between personal property, savings for security, and private property, shares and means of production, gets blurry. The source argues this weakens the rationale for a purely violent, two-class revolution for this large group.
A significant challenge for applying pure Marxist theory directly today.
It is. However, the source still stresses an important suggestion from Marxism valuable across perspectives, that any property form should not be allowed to become an instrument of exploitation and control over lives of others.
That core concern about property as unjust power runs through Marxism, social democracy, even Gandhi's trusteeship.
Exactly. It's a shared worry. The source's concluding thought tried to synthesize this. Property providing genuine freedom, security, enabling talent must be admired. But property causing glaring economic disparities, division, forcing people into subhuman life or dependency must be strictly regulated.
Trying to balance individual benefits with social harm, drawing from different theories.
It seems so. And it briefly echoes earlier thinkers. Aristotle, some property needed for virtue. Excess is vice, though, focused on personal morality.
And the early socialists, like Proudhon, property is theft, highlighting that deep concern about injustice.
And Gandhi again, assessing property through social and personal morality, emphasizing non-possession and trusteeship for social service.
So we've journeyed from property as an unquestioned right, through justifications like labor or utility, to views demanding public good contribution and recognizing its power, to the radical critique of inherent exploitation.
We've grappled with those core tensions: natural right or social construct, individual claims versus social justice, labor versus ownership. What are the proper limits?
And understanding these frameworks is absolutely vital for making sense of today's debates. Wealth inequality, regulation, taxation, housing, basic income, it all comes back to these fundamental ideas about property.
Absolutely. These aren't just abstract questions. They shape our laws, economies, realities.
So here's something for you to ponder. Given this history, these theories, these powerful critiques, what do you think should be the primary purpose of property in a just society today? Is it mainly about individual liberty and incentive, or primarily about serving the common good and meeting basic needs for all? How do we navigate that tension in the world you live in right now?
A crucial question indeed. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll catch you next time.